Welcome to Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He is an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University. Dr. Reilly, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, as always, thanks for having me. Glad to be on the stream.
You wrote a paper titled Legal Skill or Systematic Structure, a quantitative examination of the reason prosecutors win. What is your thesis in this paper?
Well, that goes way back in the day. I mean, that was one of my first academic publications when I was in grad school, I think. But basically, so there are three explanations for group differences broadly. This is something I still research today. One is genetics, basically. I mean, like the hereditarian perspective in psychometrics boils down to we think black people are dumb and whites are weak, pretty much. Like group differences are due to genes. I have some problems with this, ranging from the ethical to the practical. Another one is racism is everything. This is Ibram Kendi, right? Like any group difference has to be due to some kind of hidden, subtle, institutional, set racism. And the third is that it's kind of culture and systems. Like there are variables in society that are set up in predictable ways, and the impact of those endures well after they operate, if you will. So, like, I mean, a lot of the issues in Black and Appalachian culture today, I'm sure, date back to horrendous oppression 150 years ago. That doesn't mean they can't be productively changed today. I mean, we see, for example, immigrants with the same genotype, if you will, West Africans or Northern Irishmen who actually come from much more impoverished backgrounds, becoming some of the most successful people in society. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. The paper is kind of a test of that. I noticed that in Illinois, prosecutors were winning almost all their cases. And I looked at whether this was due to legal skill. I have a couple of metrics of good lawyering. I'd actually have to pull that paper up and look at it to see what they were. I assume quality of the law school, this sort of thing, number of cases. But then secondarily, is the system set up so that almost every case is a plea bargain, a nolle prosecco, so on down the line? And what I found is that in Illinois, prosecutors maintain these 98% winning records by almost invariably just saying, you're going to get 2 years in jail if you lose in this case, or you can take this plea bargain, go on probation, and give me one in the W column. So the systemic variable that's really prevalent in the criminal justice system is this kind of interplay between the lawyers in general, where there's a strong guild interest. So if you have a public defender, my one advice to you, if you're ever charged with a crime, get a good lawyer. I mean, like if you look at what predicts success in court, it's not race, it's not even social class, it's the kind of counsel you have. Chris Rock famously said if OJ had been driving a bus, he would never be OJ Simpson, famous innocent defendant. He'd be Orenthal, the bus driving murderer. So, I mean, it's the same thing here. Very often, if you have a public defender, they're going to be handling 47 cases, and they're going to be friends with the prosecutor. They play softball against each other in the summer and so on. So your case is almost certainly going to be plea bargain. You're almost certainly going to take that L. This is why so many young black and working class white men, by the way, I'm swaying to the left here, surprisingly, but wind up with that one felony conviction that makes it very hard to work. Often for just some bullshit that shouldn't be illegal. I mean, like you have an ounce of cocaine in your house. I mean, I understand it's a serious crime, but that's not necessarily something the government should be regulating in the first place. But if you have a felony distribution charge and that leads to a conviction, it's going to be tough for you. So that was that paper. I found the prosecutors are pretty good lawyers, actually. But they win most of the time because the system is set up to issue a bargained defeat in almost every case. And you have to almost count cards and game the system if you're charged with a crime. You have to get a good lawyer and play the game. You delay, you continue to the point where the prosecutor wants to get rid of your case. And that's surprisingly easy to do if you're a person of means.
Another paper you wrote, The Effect of Racial Status and Other Core Characteristics on Collective Self-Esteem, a quantitative test of divergent theories of identity valuation. What was your thesis in this dissertation of yours?
Where'd you get these papers? Were you digging through solid tier 2 political science journals? So this is the first interview where someone's been like, in 2018, as part of the non-controversial portion of your work. Okay, but that was a paper. It actually became my dissertation. But so this, I think, is one of the more important things I've found in terms of pure academic work before kind of getting into the culture war debate. And I mean, frankly, if someone offers you, X number of 100K to write a book, you're probably going to. I keep them quite academic. But this was a piece that was pretty much pure social science. I was genuinely interested in this. In 1992, a guy named Andrew Hacker asked a group of white guys in Queens how much they'd have to be paid to be black. And this really, along with Peggy McIntosh's article, is the root of the idea of white privilege. It's called the Hacker test. What he found is that the average answer given by white guys for how much money they'd have to be paid to become black was $50 million. And the general assumption that he made as a result of this is that white status has a great deal of value in this, racist, sexist, cis-sexist, heterosexist, speciesist, post-colonialist. Like, the joke is, I hope I got it all in there, but in this kind of society. And for my first really serious paper and then graduate dissertation, I just checked this by surveying standard large N survey of about 2,000 people of all races and asking them, if you view this question as having value at all, you always include an opt-out option if you're doing this kind of research. How much money would you have to be paid to change your race? And the average answer from everyone was over $50 million, one, and minorities demanded more than whites did, two. So the most racist group, if you take this as a measure of racism at all, was old Asian men, which I think is funny. This gets into almost conflict between societies and so on. But in general, blacks, for example, at least in the first part of the study, demanded more money than whites did. Whites were, I think, the third least racist group out of 6 or 7. I looked at Middle Easterners, people of Asian descent. And the general conclusion was that most people, whether they view their group as temporarily advantaged or temporarily disadvantaged, favor their own racial identity. And I did a couple of controls where I looked at sex, sexual orientation, which was very interesting, actually. Virtually no one, and people were very explicitly discussing things like the odor of different kinds of sex. Like, virtually no one would change their sexual tastes. I asked about religious faith tradition, I guess you could put it. Is this something you would change for money, or is the spiritual risk too significant? And the overarching conclusion, I'm rambling here a little, was that everyone liked their core identity unless they identified as having very low self-esteem, which is actually one of the questions on the survey. There were very few differences between blacks and whites, for example. And this is Zach Goldberg is a guy who's done some good research on this right now. He's looking at what's called the Great Awakening. But one of the things he's found in his tables, I think this was in Tablet magazine a couple of years ago, or maybe that better refer to that as a journal. But I mean, like, one of the things that he found was that almost everyone is racially identified to the same degree. So, like, healthy people will say they like all groups fine, kind of, but, rated 70 out of 100 or something like this. But they prefer their own group by 10 to 15 points. And this was true of everyone Goldberg looked at. It was true for blacks, like 15.2 points. We were actually a little too prejudiced. It was true for Hispanics, like 13 or 14, white conservatives, 12 to 13, Asians. The one exception was white liberals, who underrated their race group by like 10 points. Like, they said, first of all, they didn't like anybody. They actually had, if I recall this correctly, they had slightly lower rating scores for all the groups than like conservative bros. But they rated whites 10 points under blacks, which is just bizarre. But anyway, I mean, like, a lot of people have looked at this, like, is there white privilege that's measurable? Like, so for example, if you look at incomes for equivalent people, same school, same state, or if you look at how much people value identities, or if you look at how much people like their race, is there evidence that whites are in the lead? And the answer is no, not really. Whites seem to have about a moderate level of bias by international standards. Blacks are ahead of whites, and so on down the line.
You dedicated your book titled Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About to logos. What is logos?
Logos is the Greek alternative to pathos. I mean, the Greeks would argue that you need to understand both of these, Achilles and Odysseus and so on. Now, actually, by the way, originally, I think I had a conversation with Legal about this, but I was going to dedicate the book to Jussie Smollett. So my first book is called A Hate Crime Hoax. And this book, I'm sure, would have been a nice academic book. I mean, in terms of a couple thousand buys, people liking it. But this book came out the day before Jussie Smollett's hate crime was revealed to be a hoax. So, like, and I mean, I lean right personally, but not really all that hard. And I'd done some of the, like, business and academic media before this. But the day after the Jussie Smollett thing, I was on Tucker Carlson primetime. And all these people were sort of asking me, how common is this? And I happen to have a data set of, at the time it was 409 of these cases that's mentioned and detailed in the book. So whether or not that's anything near a majority of all hate crimes nationally, I mean, there are these debates here. This isn't something that's rare. I mean, whether you're talking about Jussie Smollett, Covington Catholic, although that's more of a hate incident, but I mean, Erica Thomas, Duke Lacrosse, Tawana Brawley, Wisconsin Parkside with the nooses on a campus, Kean College with the death threats, just dozens of these within the relatively recent past. This isn't an unusual phenomenon. So Jussie Smollett kind of helped build my new house, and I wanted to dedicate the book to him. And there was some debate about that. Like, can you do that? Is the guy mentally ill? So I moved on. That was kind of a dick move. And I dedicated it to the idea of the logical. So pathos is uncontrolled raving emotion, good for sex and certain kinds of war. But logos is the idea of analyzing things and saying, does this make sense? And the whole point of that book is looking at things that people are very passionate about, from the Black Lives Matter conversation to the current trans debate, and asking, well, what do the facts seem to say? These aren't necessarily subjects that I care very much about. I'm interested in what the data is. Then there are things that I'm considerably interested in, like interracial crime, but where the focus still is, what are the facts? It doesn't matter what black guy A on the street or white guy B on the golf course thinks. Like, what is the actual data? So the book was dedicated to that, and each chapter pursues kind of a taboo issue. So, like, what are the facts underlying Black Lives Matter? It turns out they're almost none. But what are the facts of interracial crime in the USA? In terms of serious index crime, it turns out to be 3 to 5% of it, like black on white and white on black violent crime is 3.5% of index crime. And it turns out to be 80% minority on white. So, I mean, like the realities in many, many arenas are not what people would think they are from casual observation. And that the book tries to make that point.
You said 80% of the time, but when blacks and whites are in a violent conflict, you're saying the black person is the aggressor? Is that what that stat is?
Yeah. Now, this is something that's actually extremely well known among two groups, cops, and I won't say racist, but like dissident writers. And that's almost entirely been ignored by everyone else as we've gone through these endless news cycles about Dylan Roof, although in that case that's justified, I suppose. But, George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and so on down the line. The average American believes, per all the preprint data I've seen, that the majority of interracial crime is white on black, and that this is very common. But the sort of taboo fact that I'm mentioning is the reality. So first, to clarify those numbers a little bit, when I say interracial violent crime is 3% of crime, what I mean is that there's an annual crime report called the BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics report, that comes out and really breaks down the crime data for the USA, using everything from some police outreach to, and this is the large majority of it, individual randomized contacts with citizens, people who've been victims. But at any rate, they estimate there are about 20 million serious crimes in a typical year. This includes violent crime and the most serious property crime, burglary, home invasion, carjacking, and no one really disputes this figure. Of those crimes, about 600,000 in a typical year are going to be violent crimes where either a white guy attacks a black guy or a black guy attacks a white guy. So a description you'll hear from me, and fairly often in CJ, criminal justice, is interracial violent crime is about 3% of serious, mostly violent crime. I mean, that's 600,000 over 20 million. It's not that hard to do. But the thing that's notable about this is, I mean, if you look at those cases, because the most common like intergroup street felony crime is robbery, there's a very strong slant in favor of black perps attacking white victims. So you occasionally see something horrible like the James Byrd dragging, but most of the white on black situations are just fights, or they're racial brawls, or they're high school conflicts or something like that. The black on white situations are very often abusive street robberies, rapes, things like that. So again, this is a tiny chunk of crime. The person most likely to kill you is your husband or your wife. But yeah, it's mass majority minority on white. And again, this is only relevant. A lot of these things in kind of the online conversation where you have like the actual like Ibram Kendi left on the one corner, and then you have like the intellectual dark web from Ben Shapiro to Sam Harris, which is where I'd fall on the other. Then you have like the John Derbyshire alt-right guys over here. One of the reasons so many, I think, edgy things are brought up by all the teams involved in that is just that quote unquote normies refuse to recognize them. Like the difference itself is extraordinary. the effect of interracial crime on day-to-day life is extraordinarily small. But if this is going to be a topic of national discourse, it's extremely bizarre that it be slanted in kind of the white on black direction. So there's a considerable amount of sort of hidden conversation around this, and the book just kind of pulls the figures to light, I guess.
The reason that I think this issue matters, along with chapter 1, the police aren't murdering black people, is because if I have the view that basically everyone is acting the same, yet we see a disproportionate number of people having something or engaged in that activity, if my first thing is to jump to, well, this is proof of oppression, well, then I, as a man, would say men are 50% of the population, yet 95% of those killed by police and 90 to 95% of those in prison. And we need a male lives matter movement. And if I have to riot and start intimidating women so I can stop being oppressed, well, then that's a small price to pay for this virtuous narrative that I'm upholding. So my intention here is to really sort of decrease the amount of tension between the races just by bringing this up. When it comes to chapter 1, the police aren't murdering black people. Very straightforward title. I think I know what this is about. When it comes to, I mean, Philando Castillo, Eric Garner, George Floyd, how can you say such a thing?
Well, I think generally when you speak as a scientist or a journalist, you're speaking in broad numbers. I mean, otherwise your claim becomes absurd. That's a very good question. But like, if I said whites aren't murdering black people, it would be, or blacks aren't murdering white people or something like that. Those would be accurate statements. But someone could respond by saying, well, like, what about the Knoxville horror where a couple was both raped and killed by a group that was either majority or all black? That's a black murdering a white. And I mean, the response is, well, yes, but we're talking about the overall sweep of murders in this country. So first, I think there are two levels there. First, I'm going to get into the cases you bring up, because even those are very illustrative of what our media is. But first, I'm going to just talk about the overall numbers. None of this is disputed. I mean, I wrote this in a major book. I've discussed it seriously in serious, if I recall correctly, in academic articles. To find out the number of people that are shot annually by the police, you can literally just go to the Washington Post database called Killed by Police, or the Police Shootings Database. So in a typical year, there are about 1,000 people that are killed by cops. That's it. I mean, that's more than Norway or Sweden or something like that. As a starting point, we have 20 times the population, but it's not an extraordinarily large number out of 350 million people. To put that in context, the average person who identifies as a left liberal believes that the number of just unarmed, just black, just men shot by police in a typical year is between 1,000 and 10,000. Skeptic Research Center found that out pretty recently. So the total number is 900 to 1,000 in a year. Of those people, only about 250 are going to be identified as black, first of all. So you can talk about there's some disproportion there, and you can have a real adult conversation about, is there a residual for racism there, or is that due to a higher crime rate in the black community? I'd be interested in seeing more of that discussion in the mainstream. But the reality is that 75% of these people are white or Hispanic Caucasians, and those cases receive about 10% of all the notice in this sector. So that's point one. If you want to extend that into unarmed people, I mean, the reality is less than 100 unarmed people are killed by the police in a typical year, well under 100, in fact. And of those, say 80, last year, 18 were black. I mean, so the total number of unarmed black people, males and females, by the way, killed by the police last year, typical bad year, was 18. So again, we can all oppose death, like Bill Maher says, I'll go on a limb and say I'm against murder, no matter who does it. Damn it. But like, we can also recognize that's an infinitesimal number. Like, we're all going to die. Humans aren't elves. It's the doom of men. So this is not a massive national problem in the first place. And it doesn't seem to be a very racialized problem. The few times I've really tried to crack out this data, looking at, high shooting states like Arkansas, and this isn't in a book yet, it's not at that level. But I mean, the groups most shot by police seem to be poor whites and Latinos, where there's no racial representation of the kind that black or even native cats might get. There are no real lobbying organizations. If you're a redneck tough guy, you're here illegally. Not that all Latinos are, obviously. But I mean, like, those are the highest tragedy groups. There's no discussion of this. Even getting into, I guess this is point 3, the specific cases you mentioned, The George Floyd case, obviously terrible policing. Like if you see the guy's dying, you don't keep him in a knee neck hold. You have to try to do something, even though it's an unfriendly crowd, so on. But the majority of those cases aren't murders. I mean, maybe we'll get back into Floyd if we have time, but like Breonna Taylor, the Breonna Taylor situation is one that hit close to home. This was in Louisville, which is right next to where I live. And obviously, I'm not a big fan of no-knock warrants. I mean, we're both coming in with something of a rightist libertarian perspective, as I understand. You think a young nurse has an ounce of blow. Maybe you come at 8 a.m. You don't have 10 guys kick down the door like Jesse James and his crew, and people are going to respond to that with violence. But the simple reality is that under law as it currently exists, the police actually had a valid warrant. It's of a kind called a no-knock warrant. It was signed off by a judge. They come to the apartment. They, in fact, apparently do knock, according to a couple of employed African-American witnesses, right? And someone starts shooting at them. And this gets into the background of the situation, which is that Breonna Taylor, whether or not she sold personally, I don't think she did, was the intimate partner of a guy who in Louisville was nicknamed Chop, El Chapo, one of the city's bigger drug dealers. They broke up, but the police were interested in whether Breonna Taylor knew the whereabouts of some of his vehicles, knew about his drug business, as I understand, so on. And when they come in, they very specifically and correctly identified her, and they're looking for her. And her new partner quite possibly thinks this is her ex-boyfriend's men at the door. And he opens fire with a semi-automatic pistol. He actually shoots a cop in the leg. He almost crippled the guy. And in response, the police start discharging firearms. And one guy who shot wildly, who almost shot a neighbor, he hit like the wall of an adjoining apartment, was in fact charged. He may very well see prison. But the other police officers were guys responding in a tactically proper way to someone who was shooting at them. And unfortunately, in the crossfire, and I don't know about if this is true, there's considerable speculation in Louisville that the guy in the apartment attempted to use Breonna Taylor as a shield against gunfire. I mean, that's discussed in the papers, at least in the comments and the responses that you see in this city. Whether or not that's true, I mean, Breonna Taylor was killed in the crossfire of a gun battle that her partner started. So you can say, well, that's a tragedy. You can punish the cop that shot wildly, so on down the line. But to call that a murder in any traditional sense of that word, like a premeditated violent homicide, that is not accurate. And that's true of almost all these cases. I mean, George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin because the two men were involved in what, if they were the same race, I might be blunt enough to call a stupid fight. One guy was following the other guy turns around, sucker punches him. They start going at it. They're brawling in front of a strip of houses in this rather pleasant subdivision. People see it. There are multiple witnesses testifying to exactly what I said. Zimmerman's getting the worst of it. He's, quote unquote, taking an ass whipping, and he pulls out a gun, which is unfortunately common in the USA, and shoots Martin. But the idea that these are sort of just classic, predictable cases motivated by extreme racism or something like that, I think there's very little evidence of that. Any real conversation about how to reform policing, by the way, is really unpopular with everyone. Like if you start talking about getting rid of qualified immunity on the one hand, or why do we have public sector unions, or if you start pointing out that among Black, or for that matter, hood white men, one of the biggest predictors of this is resisting arrest. I mean, you just have an angry back and forth in the audience. Not much gets done. But no, I wouldn't describe those as murders.
Are you familiar with the gentleman Duncan Lemp who was killed one day after Breonna Taylor in his house, and there was no shooting coming from the house?
Well, yeah, that's one of the other things that comes up in this sector. And I mean, I'm very comfortable talking about this openly. I mean, so I mentioned that whether or not you think that residual gap is due to racism, or whether you think it's due, frankly, to higher crime rate, we can discuss it. The simple reality is that 70 to 80% of the people that are killed by police, and a pretty comparable percentage of the people that are killed by police while they're unarmed, are just white dudes, or what I would think of as Spanish guys, Hispanic individuals. And there's virtually no coverage of this. I mean, in some of my classes, I've actually asked that question. 70% of the people that are shot and killed by police are Caucasian. Can you name one of them? And I've had one kid do it once. It was an Appalachian white kid, and he named Dylan Noble. But yeah, this is extremely common. I think it was Tony Temple was the guy who was asked to get on his knees and was sort of begging the police not to kill him, and was shot by the cops. That was strictly a regional story. There are dozens of these, but yeah, Duncan Lemp was one of a couple of cases right around the time of the Breonna Taylor case where a guy who was white or Latino was just at their house, and police came in, similar no-knock situation, and the guy was killed. There wasn't, if you will, a market for that. I don't even kind of know why this is, to some extent. Like, it strikes me that if you were acting in good faith and you were a BLM chapter that was really focused on limiting police, you would say, this is a men's issue. This is a working class issue. There's a big problem in the cities with conflict between cops and young men, and a lot of guys are getting shot. And some of these cases, like Limp, are pretty ridiculous. Like, are you with us on this? Are you with us on some restrictions on these kind of fighters for the state? And I think that would have been extraordinarily popular, from kind of the almost the, an-lib right over to like the pro-black left. But BLM, I mean, very specifically focused on black victims, and then moved to focus as well on all of these other side issues. So like, I criticized their website in the book, but like, one of the things on the site is justice for Palestine. I mean, one of them for a very long time was abolition of the nuclear family. So none of this had a damn thing to do with stopping violence in black communities. And that was kind of the major critique from the beginning. But yes, the police aren't mass murdering citizens of whatever race. One, it's 70+% of the people shot by cops are Caucasians, broadly defined. Yes, all that is accurate.
And then this one was also horrible. It was caught on security camera. The guy's name was Kelly Thomas. You mentioned the Duncan Lemp one. The reason that I think this aspect of it is also very important is I was brought up Jewish and always told that basically everyone's out to get me. I mean, you're going to school today. Good luck getting home. I mean, we live in Arizona. It basically hell on earth for us Jews. And no one really knew about it. And then my bar mitzvah came around and I'm like, well, it was nice enjoying life. And then like everyone thought it was so cool in my, 99% Protestant school that I went to, 99% at least Christian or Catholic. And here I was terrified about every turn. Someone's going to, call me the K word and, hit my yarmulke off. I was terrified for nothing. Not to say that no anti-Semitism exists, but I had carried around this burden so unnecessarily. The opportunity cost of that, the insecurity that it creates, I think it's so counterproductive.
I think so too.
One of the things that, I mean, abortion is basically taking over everything right now. But when it comes back to the racism, which I'm sure it will very soon, I want to cite Ibram X. Kendi's definition of what it means to be a racist and anti-racist. You tell me what, if anything, is wrong with this. Kendi says, racist, one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea, whereas an anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. What, if anything, is wrong with those definitions?
Well, what's wrong with that is, and I mean, no offense to Kendi, who's a nice enough guy, but he's doing some damage with this stuff. I mean, what's wrong with this is just meaningless bullshit. I mean, so he's using the definition of the word while outlining the meaning of the word. Like, you can't even do that as a freestyle rapper. Like, someone got ridiculed for this. Actually, I'm a hip hop kid, as you may be, but I think it was Young Jeezy who said, I got them things flying across the Atlantic on Atlantic. And like, music review magazines were just like, nope, that alone, this is 2 stars. So I mean, this is the same kind of thing. I mean, so I'll get into what he says and then get into what he means and what's wrong with that. So what Kendi is saying, the actual definition itself, I've heard him also say, like, a racist policy is a policy that's based on racist premises, managed by racist people, that produces racist outcomes. That's racism. And then someone asked, well, what's anti-racism? And he said, and I'm not kidding, the opposite. So, I mean, obviously that's almost meaningless. Like, this reminds me of kind of the gender debate questions that are being asked, like, what is a woman? And I actually think there's a fascinating conversation about this. But I mean, when people start saying things like it's someone who identifies as feminine based on understandings of womanness that come from womaninity, it's like, well, I don't think you're responding to me, because all of those things are based on the idea of what a woman is that you haven't explained to me. So similarly with Dr. Kendi. Now, the real issue with Kendi's definition, though, isn't that there's an element of flim-flam to it. It's that there's actually a very explicit meaning underlying that. So Kendi has accepted what I think of as the 3 principles of wokeness. During a debate, I was challenged to explain what I actually mean when I say woke. And in an article in City Journal, I actually did. I read through about 20 of these publications, Delgado and Stefanczyk and so on. And I said that all woke thinking seems to share three premises. One is that the facially neutral institutions in society, like standardized testing or the carceral system, are in fact set up to oppress, whoever. Blacks is a common one. You sometimes still see poor whites from old school commies. Women, that's feminist theory kind of replaces the rich man with the man as big bad, and so on down the line. So point one is all facially neutral systems are set up to oppress. Point two is that the evidence of this oppression is simply the existence of any performance gap between groups. And you cited this very eloquently earlier. I mean, Kendi explains it as the only two explanations for a large performance gap, like the one we see between whites and blacks in testing, is one, inferiority, by which I think he means genetic inferiority on the part of one of the groups, or two, some kind of racism, no matter how hidden, how subtle. We know it has to be there because we're not genetic racists, now are we? So that's point two. Like, the evidence of the hierarchical bias is the performance difference. And point three, the solution to this is equity. So equity in practice means proportional representation regardless of performance. I've been a boss a number of times, and whenever someone says we want to have an equity policy when it comes to new traders on this floor or something like that, sales guys in this bullpen would have been more my role. But I mean, like, what that means is we want out of 10 guys, 2 black guys, a Hispanic guy, an Asian guy, half of the guys will be women, so on down the line. Like, that's what equity invariably means. So the problem with this is, as a definition of racism, is that the basic assumptions are wrong. And I mean, like, jump in at any point if you agree or disagree with some of this, but like, the problem with the argument that the only two explanations for finish line differences, as I call them, are one, genetic inferiority or unchangeable cultural inferiority or something like that, or two, hidden magic racism, is that in fact, in quantitative research, going back to say Tom Sowell, Amy Chua, John Agbu, we can very easily break down the actual differences between very large groups in society. So, for example, my favorite one, the most common age for a black man, perfectly fair to call this the modal average, is 27. For a white guy, it's 58. Even the median gap between blacks and whites is on the order of 12 years. So when you talk about anything, whether it's crime rates on the right or whether it's wealth gaps on the left, that doesn't take into account the fact guy A is 3 years older than guy B, you're just being dishonest, at least implicitly. And if you adjust for all of this stuff, if you adjust for age, if you adjust for region, blacks are much more likely to live in the lower income South. If you adjust for test scores, it's silly to pretend that your literal IQ score doesn't predict the income you're going to make in life. These gaps close to something like 2 or 3%, which probably is the measure for actual racism. Like, no one denies there are some racists. But that's the problem with Kendi's definition. He's taking any gap to mean racism, and he's defining any policy as racist that produces any gap between groups. The problem, and if you confront him on Twitter or something like this, he'll actually admit this low key. The problem is that that's every gap. So Kendi and his like would always be in power and would be able to monitor every aspect of society if we took these dudes seriously. Literally any system. I mean, this may not demonstrate the point Kendi would like it to, but I'm a big basketball fan. The NBA draft every year is all male. It's all big black and Balto-Slavic guys. There's one competitive Asian American player in the entire league, Jeremy Lin. If you want to flip this back to something that advantages whites, I mean, rates of COVID vaccination were higher in white communities, largely just because black people didn't want to get vaccinated, but also because there really are fewer clinics in the rural South and so on. Literally anything, like an attempt to give free vaccinations to people of every race, or a sporting institutional draft, could be described as racist by the Kendi standard. And my response to that is not, oh, everything's racist, so terrible, let me give Ibram Kendi some money. It is, there's obviously something wrong with that definition. It's just meaningless.
And it almost opens the door for like an eternal justification to get more power. It's commonly referred to as the iron law of oligarchy, where if you get, 100 people together with the same background, the people who are better spokesmen are going to have more power within that group. Even if you have a union, it's not going to be, instead of the bourgeoisie, we're all going to be equal in the union. Well, not everyone goes to the union meeting, and not everyone's as persuasive as what they want their demands to be. So it ends up being Jimmy Hoffa and a few friends and tens of thousands of other people. So it's almost like he's saying this, if there's an inequality, well, that justifies drastic transformation of, our societal social structures. But those are always going to exist under, whether it's capitalism, communism, or fascism. You're always going to see these inequalities. And it's almost like that is the point of the definition, for it to be so vague that it can always apply. It certainly seems like that's a major hole in a guy who's gets 20 grand to speak at the Aspen Institute.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that something that saves a lot of time is the kind of predatory, honorable, but basically amoral cynicism that you develop in business. I mean, I think if you assume that most people are motivated by their own best interests, they won't do things like commit rape or unprovokedly kill puppies usually, but they're out to get money. They don't care very much about strangers and non-intimates. Closies is the word I would use. You find that once you realize this, what I've heard jokingly called the dark enlightenment, the old line, the prince of this world is not God. We don't need to get into spiritual babble. But like once you realize how humans normally behave during non-spiritual behaviors in their life, you can pretty easily predict what's going to happen. A major problem actually in political science, up until fairly recently, in my opinion, has been the tendency to judge programs based on their intentions, I suppose you could say, rather than their results. So when you talk about affirmative action, I mean, if you're doing so with a left-wing black political scientist or sociologist, they'll invariably begin by listing historical battles, literally, that blacks or natives lost and whites won. I mean, what about the massacre at Little Bighorn? What about the Tulsa race? I think riot is more appropriate than massacre. But I mean, like, what about this? Don't you think we owe people a debt? And that's a fascinating conversation. But a more productive conversation is like, do the programs work? Like, if you give kids a 200-point boost when they apply to college, don't you think it's likely they're going to devote 20% less time to their studies? And what you find, if you look at study gaps between blacks, whites, Hispanics, and Asians, is that that's exactly the incentive-based predictive model is literally like 99% correct. It's eerie. So I'd almost ask how I got into. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, amoral prediction of behavior based on incentives is pretty accurate. And I think that when you look at, for example, affirmative action, when you look at all of this pro-minority stuff, you really see this pattern illustrated in the actual waking world. So, I mean, it would be very easy to design a class-based affirmative action program. Speaking as someone who's a college professor and who's been a university executive, right? All you'd have to do is give people the same 200 points, but based on, say, the income of the zip code they come from. You wouldn't just let their dad and mom make up their own income. You'd go online, you'd check it out. As it turns out, this would still dramatically advantage Black and Latino kids, but it would also advantage poor whites, who are very often stuck in the hood alongside their buddies. If you look at in Chicago, Boston, many other cities, Italian, Irish American, Bosnian American kids. So this would be a much fairer way of getting poor people into college. What I've seen, at least in my life, is that the opposition to this comes from rich blacks, basically. Or it might be better to say rich minorities. But like right now, if you have an affirmative action program that doesn't take class into account and is based on race, the most advantaged people are going to be very rich, quote unquote, people of color. So like if you're Will Smith's son or Chris Rock's son, you are going to be treated in the black column when you apply to Stanford, even though your SAT is probably something like 1110. And you had access to a whole range of varsity athletics and extracurriculars and so on. So when you say, well, why don't we do this based on a class model so we can let in the broke Lebanese kid from Detroit, you again get back to people on the basis of their own amoral incentives suddenly really intensely recalling what happened in Tulsa, 105 years ago. So all this is very prevalent. The thing with Ibram Kendi, which is I think what we were initially on, I tend to be a long talker, but the thing with Kendi's very open about this. I mean, Kendi has said, the solution to discrimination in the past is open racial discrimination today. That's pretty much a quote. And the secret to any gaps or any discrimination in the present is open racial discrimination in the future. So in a famous piece for Politico, he proposed what he called, I think, a Department of Equity, Department of Anti-Racism maybe, that would monitor the actions of every US government branch forever. And every time the races fell out of proportion by more than 20% or whatever his cutoff was, they would take action to simply mandate the hiring of X number of blacks or Hispanics or whatever. And the one thing that guys like this never answer is, well, okay, now minorities are doing pretty well. We're 39% of the country. We're dominant in fields ranging from athletics to some of the softer sciences. Does this apply in reverse? I mean, like, does the NFL draft annually have to result in the selection of 63% Caucasians? And you'll just never get an honest answer. The usual answer is the same one you hear about racism. Well, we can't be bigots because we're so oppressed, so marginalized, so pushed back to the fringes, as the guy walks into a speech where he'll collect a $20,000 check. So I don't even necessarily hate every aspect of his hustle, but that kind of is what it is. Like, these definitions are useless in day-to-day empirical life.
You wrote a chapter titled "Racism Didn't Cause the New Problems of Today." Now, when you see something like the history of slavery, Jim Crow, lynchings, how can you make such a statement?
Well, because the problems of today don't have anything to do with lynchings in 1866. I mean, so this again, this is something that I would actually encourage listeners to pay close attention to the extent that either of us should be, closely monitored at all. But this is a fairly key point. There's a difference between demonstrating that racism exists and demonstrating that racism is causally responsible for phenomena A through Z that we're talking about. So yes, of course, racism exists. In fact, I mean, if you really want to get heterodox, minorities are slightly more racist than whites in most cases. Blacks and Asians certainly are, by every metric I've seen. So yeah, 1 in 10 whites, 1 in 8 people of color is a bigot. It probably is more relevant for whites, who are still the dominant pop group in society. Yeah, no one sane is disputing that. And of course, there was more racism in the past. No one disagrees with that. So it's perfectly valid to bring up the lynching numbers when it comes to a question of Black household wealth in certain high lynching states or something like that. Very often, very successful Black men were targeted, and they were forced to either move or potentially be killed. But that doesn't have anything to do with the question of, does ethnic conflict, especially 100 years ago, predict problems today? And there are 3 real problems with that claim. So like the thing I talk about in this context in Taboo is illegitimacy rates, fatherlessness rates. So the almost universal excuse that's made for Black people, with or without our consent, is, well, that's the legacy of slavery. You see a 72% illegitimacy rate. We're not even going to criticize you about that because we once owned and broke up Black families. The problem with that is that the Integrated Northern Army kicked the South's ass for doing that back in 1866. And not long after that, you began to see very stable Black families. I mean, slaves literally wandered the southlands of the country looking for relatives they'd been separated from. The fatherlessness rate under slavery, by the way, was only something like 21%. If you look at the number of families that weren't composed of at least a common law marriage, husband and wife. But I mean, by 1938, when Walter Williams wrote about this, the illegitimacy rate for Black families was on the order of 10%. So that's the baseline. There had been damage done by conflict with and abuse from whites. There was a period of quite some time, you're talking about World War II now almost, where that was remedied, and you have a 10% baseline illegitimacy rate. Whites were doing a bit better at the time. It was 4 to 5%, by the way. But I mean, this is one of those things where everyone's fairly successful. Asian rates are also very low. Hispanic, Catholic rates are very low. And then you saw modern innovations. I mean, moving into the 50s, 60s, 70s, you saw the growth of massive social welfare programs like AFDC. You saw the later waves of feminism and no-fault divorce. You saw, and I'll chalk a lot of this one up to the right, you saw the outsourcing of good blue-collar jobs. And that's when you started seeing these increases in Black fatherlessness. So there are 3 problems with the claim that this is due to racial conflict. One, when racism and racial conflict were much worse, the problem didn't exist for Blacks or whites. That's the simplest. There are people that are great, like William Julius Wilson, that have tried a little bit to almost rationalize this. Different sorts of jobs are available and so on. But the simple fact is that no one can argue persuasively. There's more racism today than there was in 1911. So that's issue 1. Issue 2 is that these same problems don't seem to affect minority immigrants at all. So the most successful people in the country are members of groups that are severely discriminated against, more so than Black Americans in many cases, for being members of visible minorities. I mean, you're talking about Chinese Americans, Orthodox Jews, Black foreigners, Jamaicans, Nigerians. So again, that's almost impossible to explain through this narrative of race alone. Okay, it might make sense Black fatherlessness is elevated because of racism. Well, let's check on Nigerian fatherlessness, and you find that's 11% or whatever it is. Why doesn't the same effect obtain in foreign Black communities at all? And that's something that sort of the Kendi Angelist school has trouble answering. And the third point, I think, because I want us to move toward thinking of one another in terms of being countrymen rather than along these racial and class lines in many cases. But the third point is that these same problems are absolutely epidemic for working class whites, which is the large majority of the white population. In addition to other problems like suicide, opiates, we tend to focus on drugs and violence in Black communities and ignore the fact that many of these same issues exist in poor and even formerly middle-class white communities. I mean, I live in Appalachia. But so the fatherlessness rate among working poor whites in the South is something like 50%. It's hard to pin it down across categories. But why would that happen if fatherlessness is the result of slavery alone? So what you really have here is an odd situation where you've got two paradigms, one of which is embraced by almost everyone in power, but explains absolutely nothing. And the other one of which is considered, and this is true for every sort of heterodox paradigm, by the way. I'm not a genetic hereditarian, but that's been cast to the total margins. And I'm not sure it has been proven that Westerners are as potentially intelligent as Asians, for example. Again, not my theory, but that Arthur Jensen, all that's been almost totally forgotten. But then you have my paradigm, culturalism, you have the non-Marxist kind of structural theories, and all of this has just been sort of dismissed as retrograde, nonsensical. The problem is that a lot of it, especially I think what I'm outlining here, actually does explain what we see. I mean, a simple one-sentence closer for this segment might be, I mentioned that I don't think you need to invoke racism or genetics to explain academic performance. There's a great chart. If you Google Brookings Institute study time by ethnic group, it's literally just the amount of study that each ethnic group does, predictably enough. But I mean, it's like whites, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, lower income, upper income, and that's tracked against test scores. And the explanatory power is phenomenal, let's say. So I think that people should focus more on what seems to be evidently testably true than kind of what you're supposed to say.
So let's take the example of male victims of police brutality. Can you sort of intellectually walk us through how we could sort of test this theory? Let me play the reverse SJW. Men are mostly disproportionately victims of violence from the police. Looking at the victims by gender here from the Washington Post. This is the legacy of military conscription going back thousands of years. Men had to perform forced labor under the worst conditions. This trauma makes them more violent. How would you go about disproving this claim? Walk us through this logos methodology so we could understand it and apply it to other areas of our academic life.
That's a fascinating and excellent example, because I really do think that this indicates how stupid it is to dismiss culturalism, the systems theories. I'll even throw hereditarianism.
Testosterone.
Yeah, I mean, but definitely hereditarianism has a huge role in this one, the male-female one. I mean, you're not incorrect. Like what you are saying, like the claim that differences in Black-white arrest rates reflect bias somewhere in the criminal justice system above the level of the victim is simply not true. Right now, and I actually think age is probably the primary explicator here. If you add in age, urban status, and income, I think a lot of that crime gap would vanish. You also would have to look at the extent to which the Black-white crime gap has increased in heavily minority areas that are no longer enforcing the law, which is, again, a purely cultural, purely recent variable. But I mean, the argument that the Black-white crime gap is due to hidden racism in the laws is simply not true. So you're arguing that if you said you're the reverse SJW here, you're asking a very logical question, which is if people are seriously alleging that, why would they not allege that the male-female crime gap, men commit 89 to 95% of the crimes, I believe, is somehow the result of prejudice? And you outlined a couple of the versions of this. I mean, people will sometimes say that there are rules that are selectively enforced against, say, blacks rather than whites. People will sometimes say that there's a legacy of slavery that I guess forces black people to commit crimes. There's a higher level of depression, anger, perhaps psychopathia, so on down the line. Like whatever form of racism you want, police will only target black people and they will leave aside equivalent whites. If you take this seriously, you would have to make the same argument for males. I think that's the short version of a windy speech I was going to give. Yeah, the analogy is accurate. The problem is that there's an alternative theory that is visibly correct, which is that for genetic, cultural, and social reasons, men are far more violent than women. And I mean, this is what Gad Saad calls the network of supporting information that you want to, neurological networks of information that you want to form when you analyze something. So, I mean, for example, you can look across different societies and see that men are almost always the perpetrators of crime. You can do a simple test to see whether males are bigger and slightly dumber than women. You could test levels of testosterone in the body. We know that's a substantial predictor of the most common sorts of crime: fist fighting, sexual assault. And you can just do on and on and on, test each one of these theories, and each one will confirm that there are reasons other than bias that men attack women. When it comes to blacks versus whites or something like that, I mean, especially given what Italian, Irish, American, so on crime rates have been in the past, I think you're looking more at cultural than genetic variables. But similarly, you could look at rate of fatherless homes. We know that's a predictor of crime among males. You could look at income. That's not as big a predictor as people think it is, but you certainly have higher crime rates among poor people than rich people in most cases. You could look at test scores, like people that aren't performing well in school are much more likely to skip out for a couple of days, engage in violence, brawling, so on. And what you generally find is that when you adjust for those things, you've explained the difference in crime. So the almost religious, again, sort of kindy argument, which is that this has to be due to some kind of systemic prejudice. Again, there's no more support for that in the racial context than there would be in the context of sex. I think that is correct.
So Barack Obama came out and said that it's not myth, it's math. Men make, for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes like 77 cents. Can you walk us through how you would go about, because he's flat out saying the statistics. Jimmy Carter even said this in his debate with Ronald Reagan in 1980. So we have very powerful people for a very long time giving us a cold, hard statistic. When you face that, how can you go about verifying the legitimacy of something like that and really putting it to the test to see if this is something that's real?
Well, I think that this gets into, it's like there's a very old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I think that this kind of univariate data is maybe the best illustration of that, because if you are a quote unquote midwit, if you're some guy, and this is such an obnoxious thing to say, but like if you're a kid on Twitter with an associate's degree and an IQ of like 108, if you see a statistic that illustrates income differences between groups or something like that, your inclination would be, well, this is what it is. This is flat, hard data. It's the hardest data available, and no one's going to be able to play some complex mathematical trick and prove me wrong. But alas, young man, that is completely incorrect. I mean, there's a secondary level of data analysis that we call regressive or multivariate, and it's very easy to take apart statistics like this. So I guess I'll open with sort of a slogan and then go into the analytical process. The slogan would just be always be multivariate. To find prejudice, if that's what we're talking about here, you have to do something very specific. And that is adjust for all of the variables other than race or sex that could affect an outcome, so that you're left, by the time you're done running your computer model or crunching the numbers on a piece of paper, comparing people that are identical except for the one thing you're looking at. So again, when you're looking at large racial groups, you find that on average, the people in them vary in terms of age dramatically. They vary in terms of region. They vary in terms of test and board scores. They vary in terms of, and this is important for income, the number of people in the household. If you're talking about a 70% single motherhood rate, whites are also doing terribly, but not quite as badly. That means that literally, at least at the time of birth, 3 out of 4 households have 1 or 2 people in them. There's a mother and a kid. Obviously, you're going to have roughly double that income if the household is a father, a mother, and 2 kids. I mean, you can't get much more basic than that, but that is a corrective of the pure univariate point that you're making. So Always be multivariate. In the particular case that you're looking at, there's a very obvious question. If it were actually the case that any ruthless businessman who is willing to overcome his prejudices could hire identical women for 75% as much as an identical male would cost, why would anyone ever hire men? It's an automatic debate winner at the start of the conversation because there is no answer to it. Do you really think that everyone in every sector of business is a bigot to that extent? Do you believe there are no female bosses? If you can't answer yes to those questions, you're left with the necessity of assuming that that statistic is false and figuring out why. And here, if you have your state or your R or whatever open, it's extremely easy to figure out why. The first adjustment you would make is just, are people working? So like every figure that I've seen that argues that women earn between 59 and 77 cents to the male dollar includes all the women that are housewives and opting not to work. So it's just an incredibly easy, almost dirty trick. 20% of your sample has no job and has a technical income of zero, even though they're probably running a good sized family purse. So that's the first way you get the income down. And then you'd adjust for all the other things. I mean, we would literally type this into what looks like an Excel data sheet and then run a line of computer code in my profession. But I mean, you'd have to adjust for the jobs people are working. Are women as likely as men to work long hours? Are women as likely as men to work in the brutally competitive fields, military officering and trial law that often pay very well? Are women more likely than men to take off, let's say, 1/8 of their total days as adult executives because they have kids? I don't mean obviously just sporadically, but are you more likely to go on maternity leave as a woman than as a man? I mean, it seems almost foolish to ask. So when you adjust for all this, there's a great paper that came out from PayScale, the business boys over there, a couple years ago, but they found the actual gap that could be attributed to sexism is like 2%. So what you have to do is get down to the same people. Even if you're just doing cross tabulations at home, you can do this. I mean, I think my method is much more effective. But if you're looking at black-white income differences, I mean, the first thing you would do is find out the average age for a white guy and a black guy. So if the average income for a white guy is 65,000, average income for a black guy is 45,000, what is the average income for white and black guys who are both 35? Okay, then you probably would want to break out an individual state. What's the average income for white and black guys that are both 35 in South Georgia? I don't know how big a gap I'd expect to see there, if any at all. But, can you find graduates of the same school? What about white and black guys who went to UGA, who live in South Georgia and who have a 1050 SAT? And by this point, I mean, people sometimes accuse you of playing numbers games, but you're not. You're reversing the numbers game. By this point, you're comparing two identical guys and seeing if there's any difference in their life outcomes. And quite often there is not.
Do you have time for two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have a general theory as to why so many, I guess not necessarily political leaders, but thought leaders tend to be of such low quality? I think of Kamala Harris, Mitch McConnell, Sean Hannity, Brian Stelter. These people get a lot of airtime, and I mean, they are nothing compared to even people that agree with them in academia are 100 times smarter and more persuasive. Do you have an idea as to why they're just so boring and average and like uneventful to watch?
Well, I think that this gets into, let me actually take some notes here. Accepted regime perspective, AA legacy. Yeah, I do have a theory. I mean, so first of all, this is something we've all seen. So one of the things that how I got started in kind of the public space actually was debating the alt-right from the left. No, it's not much of an accomplishment to be left of the alt-right. But I mean, I had a debate with Jared Taylor about the value of diversity and so on. And one of the things that surprised people when they were arguing with me online, like sort of dissident right guys would follow me to argue. And a guy told me about a year into this, I'm surprised talking with you. And I said, why? And he said, well, because you're intelligent. And I think that was actually very telling. Like, we've all on Twitter seen, again, the three groups I mentioned, IDW or actual Jacobin tankies or dissident right kids. We've seen just ordinary internet kids absolutely shred celebrities almost every time. Yeah. Like, the famous person loses 95% of the time. And I mean, we saw this with Brian Crenshaw the other day. I mean, like, Biggest Chingus or whoever, the political debater on Twitter, started roasting him about Ukraine. Like, oh, you say we got a baby formula shortage. Maybe we shouldn't have sent that $40 billion to Ukraine. And Crenshaw was a genuinely funny guy. I went back at him a couple times, and just this random kid on Twitter smoked him. I mean, like, I think I have an idea who's behind the account. He's like 29, maybe in grad school. And so it was something that we've all seen. And your question is, why do we keep all seeing it? Why is like this right guy on the internet invariably funnier than CNN anchor? I think that there are two reasons. The first is that CNN anchor is operating with a weight around their ankle because they can only express approved regime propaganda. I really think that this is a huge one. Like, if I were Ibram Kendi, I wouldn't take debates either. Because the only counter to the hereditarian perspective we've been touching on is my own equally controversial culturalist perspective. Like, if you just insist on saying, well, genes don't matter, culture doesn't matter, systems don't matter, what matters is hidden, subtle, it's like people are just going to start looking at you like, can this fool actually believe this? And I don't mean to individually insult this guy, but like, if you are sticking to what you are supposed to say as an upper middle class taxpayer in 2022, it's going to be tough for you going against like me or you, much less some guy whose internet image is just a Roman statue who doesn't give a fuck. Like, it's you're going to have no chance whatsoever. Like, I mean, one of the few debates I lost, like, I'm really culturalist on IQ. I think we've seen Irishmen. I think we're not seeing this with black people, but you see groups increase by 15, 20 points all the time. But someone actually like pulled out all the GWAS research, the genetic predictors of IQ, in one of our debates. Was like, wouldn't you agree that according to this GWAS study, at least 9% of this gap is due to genes? And there actually are some problems with the study. But if you are Ibram Kendi and someone pulls that out, like, you're going to be in a tough place. So I think that a lot of people that are in that zone just avoid the tough places. And when they get trapped on social or somewhere where they can't just flee, they often get humiliated and try to play it off. But you just have to mouth approved regime propaganda. Well, another example would be like Ukraine. I'm cheering for Ukraine in the war with Russia to the extent I care. Like, I don't like unprovoked attacks of other countries, sovereign land, all that. But it's also worth noting that the best Ukrainian fighters are Nazis. Like, they're legit, obvious Nazis. The Azov Battalion, they have a modified Schutzstaffel SS flag. It's like these two big lightning S's, and the media keeps lying about what they mean. So it is what it is. I probably wouldn't have sent them much money, if any. But watching people in mainstream positions talk about the decency and democracy of Ukraine, as opposed to just honestly saying they're better than Russia and Russia's our enemy, which is my take on the war, is pretty tough. And again, if you have to mouth that party line, if you have to mouth the line that like the Wuhan Novel Airborne Coronavirus Institute had nothing to do with COVID-19, you're going to lose a lot of debate. So that's point one. You have to stick to the absolute narrative. Point two also is just that a lot of elites are stupid. I think there's a quantifiable reason for this. For the past 35 years, the past 60 years, like, I'm not going to exaggerate levels of racism. For the past 60 years in the United States, major institutions have practiced both legacy admissions and affirmative action. And you can't help but think it had an effect. When you look at someone who seems really dumb in the public square, George W. Bush, although he certainly had his moments, but like you mentioned, I wouldn't even say Kamala Harris, like Maxine Waters, Stacey Abrams, there's a pretty good chance that they benefited from either an AA or a legacy edge. And I'm not going to name them, but when you see someone that benefited from both, you're often looking at a complete idiot. I mean, like, we've seen congressmen in recent years who were in that potentially benefited from both category. I mean, like upper class minority legacies, just as crazy shit. Like, remember that one guy who asked if the island of Guam could fall over? Like, we're building a lot of stuff over there. I mean, couldn't it topple? And like someone was like, well, you have to understand, islands are not actually balloons. Islands are pillars of rock which reach to the top of the ocean. And it was just painful, like third year marine biology kind of stuff. But I think that is the actual answer. There's a very limited number of things you can say. Consider debating race if you could not argue that genes, although don't focus on that one, culture, or any aspect of kind of structure other than racism had any effect on performance. Like, you're really running with hobbles in that situation. And again, two, you just might not be that bright. There's a common assumption that people who go to reasonably elite institutions are smart. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, like, the last I looked, the average SAT for teachers in a quite good group of state universities and lower Ivies was like 1050. I mean, like, the average for Asians is like 1200. So, I mean, depending on what field you go into, I mean, any of the studies, certainly, you don't have to be an Einstein. Like my guy James Lindsay, I mean, he sent in what 9 fake papers to top woke journals and 7 got published. I mean, this is out here bullshitting. Like one of them was like the question was, is the doggy position feminist for animals? I.e., like, do people react negatively to certain sexual behavior among dogs and dog parks? And the whole thing was just visibly invented. I think if you're in a field where you can write about canine anal sex and get published in a top journal, you don't necessarily expect a lot of geniuses in that field. So the fields that we focus on, the debate between anything from theology on the right to sociology on the left, aren't often nuclear physics. And that combines with the necessity of just repeating propaganda, I think.
The book is Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Dr. Wilfred Reilly, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I was once interested in how Black and white students perceived interactions around them. So I gave a very short survey as an example of how to do methods that asked, how many negative interactions do you have in a typical day? Arguments, perhaps a fist fight at the very worst once a year, traffic altercation, so on. Black and white students had the exact same average number of negative interactions, which I believe was 9. But Black students attributed half or more of them to racism. So I think the short version is people are told constantly by those that have a certain set of discursive ideas that the USA, 1, had this terrible history, and 2, this has never really stopped. I'm rambling a bit here, but if you've been in an academic classroom, I mean, you've heard about white privilege and cultural appropriation and stereotype threat and implicit bias and so on. And from my perspective as a quant, I mean, the question is, what impact does that all actually have when you rack it up against the other side, affirmative action, stronger families in many minority communities, so on? And the answer seems to be not much. Asians out-earn whites, Blacks come within 85%, so on. So all of that would fall into these tiny 5% gaps. But if you haven't been taught that, you've been taught it's all there. Look, there's this, there's this, there's this. This is assimilative racism. By leftist radicals your entire college career, you're going to be very vulnerable to this kind of thing. I would add 2 other things there. 1, cancel culture means that most people are not aware of the actual statistical facts of these issues. This is one reason why, I mean, I have the luxury of being pretty personally well off after working in the sales field in Chicago. This is one reason I keep talking about this stuff. If you actually look at the numbers around police violence last year, and the Washington Post occasionally plays some minor games with these, but I mean, they're pretty consistent. Last year, there were, depending on which week of data collection you look at, between 9 and 15 unarmed Black men killed by cops nationwide. That was roughly proportional. There were a bit under 60 unarmed people total killed by police last year. So let's say 10 out of 60, there are exactly 6 times as many Caucasians as there are African Americans, almost exactly in the USA, 5 to 6. The total number of people killed by police overall, this included people brandishing guns, hitting officers with cars, waving Bowie knives in the air, that was 1,004. And of those, again, you're looking at 229 of them were Black. You can argue that there is a discrepancy between 14 or 15%, 12 to 14% before you get into interracials, African Americans in the population, and 20% of the police shooting victims. But the reality is that, at least among violent crimes, there is a higher overall crime rate in the Black community. So what you actually see if you look at this is these tiny numbers. I mean, you're talking about 10 Blacks versus 30 whites. And I mean, you can bring that into, well, who's overrepresented, us or them? But the broader point to me is that there are 40 people being discussed, or 50 people.
Yes.
And I think people just aren't aware of that. There's almost a conscious taboo on talking about it. So this is point 2. Point 1 is the leftist success in the institutions. Point 2, though, and point 2 has nothing to do with personal partisan affiliation or anything. It's just a fact. It's taboo to talk about things that would totally reduce these tensions. There are no epidemics. I actually have 2 chapters about this in my book, Taboo. One is there is no epidemic of Black people being killed by police.
Right.
And perhaps I'd be a bit more sensitive with that title if I had to write it again, but I think it's just a fact.
Yeah, it is.
50 people, and they're not all Black.
Right.
There are 340 million Americans. If you look at any actual resource use data pool, that's before you get into undocumented residents and so on.
Right.
So that's it. There were 89 people killed by bees, wasps, and hornets last year.
Yeah.
So your odds of being killed by a police officer, Black or working class white or whatever else, if you're just going to the bank, are lower than your odds of being killed by a bug